Welcome back to the deep dive. I have got a stack of notes here today that is, frankly, a little intimidating.
Oh, I believe it. It's a massive topic.
It really is. But it's also incredibly exciting because we are tackling a massive transformation today. And when I say massive, I mean we are looking at a continent that completely reinvented itself from the ground up. We're talking about Europe.
Right. It is arguably the most volatile, tragic, and ultimately transformative century in European history. If you look at where we started and where we ended up, it barely looks like the same planet, let alone the same continent.
Yeah, and to set the scene for everyone listening, I want to do a little mental time travel. So I want you to close your eyes for a second. Unless you're driving, please keep them open, but just imagine the Europe of the summer of 1914.
The absolute apex.
Exactly. It is the apex of global dominance. You have these massive empires, kings and kaisers and czars, ruling over vast swaths of the globe. I mean, the British Empire covers a quarter of the landmass.
It's powerful, it's wealthy, it is culturally supremely confident.
But it is also standing on the precipice of a cliff, and it doesn't even know it yet.
That is the perfect image. 1914 is the high watermark of imperial power, but it's also the beginning of the end for that specific version of Europe. It's the start of an era of catastrophic conflict that basically, well, commits civilizational suicide.
Now, snap your fingers, jump to the present day. The kings are largely gone, or, they are cutting ribbons at flower shows. The empires have dissolved.
The map has been shredded and taped back together a dozen times.
Right. And instead of ruling the world, Europe is trying to figure out how to work together in a multipolar world. It's defined by integration, the European Union, and navigating the messy aftermath of globalization.
And that is the central narrative arc we're exploring today. How do you go from Europe ruling the world to Europe rebuilding itself? How do you go from the Kaiser to the bureaucrat in Brussels?
And specifically, for our students out there, we are laser-focused on AP European History Unit 9. That's Cold War and Contemporary Europe, roughly 1914 to the present.
And just a quick reminder for you tuning in, this unit is a heavyweight. It weighs 10 to 15% of the overall AP exam.
Which is huge.
It's equal to the Renaissance, equal to the Enlightenment. You cannot skim this. If you don't understand why the Berlin Wall fell, you are missing a massive chunk of the story.
No skimming allowed today. We are going to go deep. Our mission is to answer one core question. How did Europe rebuild after catastrophe, navigate the Cold War, and redefine itself in an interconnected global age?
And to do that, we need to keep our historical framing explicitly clear. We start in 1914, the beginning of the catastrophe, then we hit the post-1945 mark, which is the pivot point.
Europe's decline as a global hegemon.
Exactly. And finally, the present, which is a reflection of three long-term consequences: reconstruction, integration, and globalization.
So here is our roadmap for the listener. We are breaking this down into four massive slices. Part 1, the Cold War and the bipolar world order.
Setting the stage.
Right. Part 2, Western reconstruction and economic integration, basically the economic miracle.
Yeah.
Part 3 is global realignments, nationalism, and migration. And finally, Part 4, social, cultural, and technological transformations.
It sounds like a lot, but it all connects. It's really one long chain reaction.
It really is. So let's dive right into Part 1, the Cold War and the bipolar world order.
Let's do it.
Okay, so World War II ends in 1945. The Nazis are defeated. Hitler is dead. You would think, logically, that this is the moment for a victory lap. High fives all around, pop the champagne. But that isn't what happened, is it?
Not even close. The friction started before the guns even went silent. You have to remember, the alliance between the U.S., Great Britain, and the Soviet Union, the Big Three, was essentially a marriage of convenience.
They had a common enemy.
Right, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. But once Hitler was gone, the glue holding that alliance together dissolved instantly.
And the source material points to a specific broken promise as the catalyst here. The friction wasn't just vague ideological dislike, it was about specific territory.
Yes, this is crucial for understanding the breakdown. At the wartime conferences, specifically Yalta and Potsdam, Joseph Stalin, the Soviet leader, looked Churchill and Roosevelt in the eye and agreed that Eastern European nations, places like Poland, Hungary, Romania, would be allowed to hold free democratic elections.
Spoiler alert, he didn't do that.
He absolutely did not. Stalin reneged on that promise almost immediately. But to understand why, you have to get inside his head. You have to understand the Russian psychology of 1945.
Because Russia had been invaded from the West twice in 30 years.
Exactly. World War I and World War II. And the casualty count for the Soviets in World War II was,
It's unfathomable.
it is, estimates range up to 27 million people. That is a trauma that defines a nation.
So Stalin looks at that body count and says, never again.
Precisely. He viewed these Eastern European nations not as sovereign states with their own hopes and dreams, but as a necessary buffer zone, a human shield, basically. He wanted friendly communist governments between Moscow and Berlin to absorb any future attack.
So he absorbed these nations into the Soviet bloc. They became satellite states. And that term, satellite state, that's important for you to remember. It implies they revolve around the center.
Correct. Their economies, their militaries, their foreign policies, everything was dictated by Moscow. They were nominally independent on paper, they had their own flags, but in reality, they were puppets.
And this leads to that famous visual, the Iron Curtain.
Yes, Winston Churchill in 1946, he's speaking in Fulton, Missouri, and he declares that from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an Iron Curtain has descended across the continent.
It's the perfect metaphor. It wasn't just a political divide.
No, it was a physical and ideological seal. You couldn't get information in, and you couldn't get people out.
And nowhere was that divide more obvious, more painful than in Germany itself.
Germany is the microcosm of the Cold War. If you understand Germany, you understand the whole conflict. After the war, it was divided into 4 occupation zones: American, British, French, and Soviet.
And the capital, Berlin, which was deep inside the Soviet zone, was also divided into 4.
Exactly. Now, the Western Allies, the US, UK, and France, they quickly realized that you can't have a healthy European economy with a black hole in the middle of it. They wanted a strong, rebuilt Germany to anchor European recovery.
But the Soviets wanted the exact opposite.
The Soviets wanted a weak Germany. They wanted to strip it of resources, literally taking factories apart piece by piece and shipping them to Russia as reparations. They wanted to prevent Germany from ever threatening them again.
So this disagreement is what formalized the split.
Yes. The 3 Western zones eventually merged to become West Germany, democratic, capitalist. The Soviet zone became East Germany, communist, authoritarian.
So the map is drawn, you have this massive stare down, and this brings us to the American response. Because clearly the Soviets aren't stopping at the border. Enter the Truman Doctrine.
Right. President Harry Truman looks at this map, he sees the pressure the Soviets are putting on Greece and Turkey, and he realizes he needs a grand strategy. So he articulates the policy of containment.
And containment is a key AP term.
Absolutely. Containment didn't mean rolling back communism where it already existed, because rolling it back out of Poland or East Germany would mean World War III.
Right, it's like putting a lid on a boiling pot. You can't stop it from boiling, but you can stop it from spilling over into the rest of the kitchen.
Or the forest fire analogy. You dig a trench to stop the fire from spreading, you don't jump into the fire. The first test case for this was Greece.
What happened there?
There was a civil war happening between communists and anti-communists. Britain, who usually handled the geopolitics of this region, was just too broke from World War II to help.
So the U.S. steps in.
Yes, with massive financial and military aid. And it worked. The communists were defeated. This proved to Washington that containment was a viable strategy.
And this moves us from just a policy to actual physical institutions. We start seeing the teams form up.
The institutionalizing of the conflict. On the West, you get NATO in 1949, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This is a collective defense pact. The core principle is an attack on one is an attack on all.
So if the Soviets roll tanks into Paris, the United States goes to war.
Exactly. It tied American security directly to European security.
That is a massive, unprecedented commitment for the U.S. and on the East.
The Warsaw Pact. This was the Soviet counter-alliance. But there's a dark distinction here that you need to grasp. NATO was a voluntary alliance of democracies seeking protection.
Right.
The Warsaw Pact was largely a tool for the Soviets to ensure their satellite states remained obedient. It was less of a mutual defense club and more of a prison gang. If a Warsaw Pact country tried to leave or adopt democratic reforms, the other members would invade it to stop them.
Wow. And there's an economic divide too, right? Because they aren't just split militarily.
A huge economic divide. We'll talk more about the Marshall Plan in a minute, but essentially, the U.S. offered democratic money to rebuild Europe.
And the Soviets.
They forbade their satellite states from taking a single dime. They refused to allow Eastern Europe to participate in the Western economic system, which locked them into decades of economic stagnation.
So we have the teams, we have the map. But this was a Cold War. They weren't shooting at each other directly in Europe, so how did they actually fight? Because it was a war.
It was total war, fought with everything except direct military engagement between the superpowers. First, you have propaganda. The West utilized Radio Free Europe, broadcasting ideas of freedom, democracy, and rock and roll into the Soviet bloc.
And the Soviets countered that?
Vigorously. They ran campaigns highlighting Western capitalist greed, and quite effectively they pointed out the racial tensions and civil rights abuses in the United States.
Basically saying, look at how they treat their own people. Why would you want their system?
Precisely. Then you had espionage. The CIA versus the KGB versus the British SIS. Spying, stealing technology, toppling governments covertly in places like Iran and Guatemala. It was a global game of shadows.
And of course, the big one, the arms race.
The shadow that hung over the entire second half of the 20th century. The U.S. drops the atomic bomb in 1945. Then, shockingly fast, the Soviets test their own in 1949.
So the monopoly is broken.
Yes. And then the U.S. develops the hydrogen bomb, which is exponentially more powerful. The Soviets match it again. It becomes this terrifying tit-for-tat escalation.
And this leads to that terrifying concept, MAD, mutual assured destruction.
It's a paradoxical stabilizer. Both sides built up these massive arsenals, knowing full well that if they launched a nuclear strike, the other side would still have enough weapons left to wipe them off the face of the earth.
So neither side could win, which means neither side fired.
Exactly. The sheer horror of the weapons is what prevented World War III.
But just because they didn't fire nukes at Washington or Moscow doesn't mean people didn't die. We have to talk about proxy wars.
Right. This is the hot side of the Cold War. Since the U.S. and USSR couldn't fight directly without ending the world, they fought through third parties. They used other countries as their chessboards.
Let's run through the big ones for the exam, starting with Korea.
1950 to 1953. Korea was divided after World War II, just like Germany. The North was communist, supported by the Soviets and later China. The South was democratic, supported by the U.S.
And the North invades.
They roll across the 38th parallel. The U.S. and the UN intervene to save the South. Then, as the U.S. pushes north, the Chinese army intervenes to save the North.
And it ends in a stalemate.
A bloody stalemate, right back at the 38th parallel. The border barely moved, but it cemented the fact that the Cold War was going to be a global militarized conflict.
Vietnam?
Vietnam is really the tragedy of containment, roughly 1955 to 1975. The U.S. is trying to prevent a communist takeover of South Vietnam by the North, operating on the domino theory.
The idea that if one country falls to communism, all its neighbors will too.
Exactly. But Vietnam showed the severe limits of military power against an ideologically driven, anti-colonial guerrilla warfare force. It was a massive cost in blood, treasure, and domestic stability for the U.S., and it ultimately failed. The North took over.
And then later in the 70s, the tables turn in Afghanistan.
Right, 1979 to 1989. This is often called the Soviet Vietnam. The Soviets invade Afghanistan to prop up a failing communist government there.
And the U.S. sees an opportunity.
A huge one. The U.S. starts arming the Afghan resistance, the Mujahideen, with advanced weapons, like Stinger missiles that could shoot down Soviet helicopters. It became a decade-long bleeding wound for the Soviet military, draining their resources right when their economy was starting to crack.
Which brings us perfectly to the end of the story for part one, the collapse. Because the Soviet Union looked like this invincible, monolithic empire, and then poof, in the span of a couple of years, it just vanished. Why did it fall apart?
It's important to know that it wasn't primarily an external military defeat.
Yeah.
NATO didn't conquer Moscow. It was internal rot. The root cause was economic stagnation.
The planned economy.
Yes. The planned economy simply didn't work in the modern era.
Let's unpack that for a second. Why didn't it work? On paper, providing for everyone sounds efficient.
But in practice, it's a nightmare. In a planned economy, a bureaucrat in Moscow decides what a factory in Siberia should produce. They say, make 10,000 left shoes. There are no supply and demand signals like in a market economy.
So you get massive inefficiency and waste.
Huge waste. Shortages of basic goods like toilet paper and bread, but a surplus of low-quality tractors. But more importantly, there was no worker incentive.
Because everyone gets paid regardless.
Exactly. If you get paid the exact same, regardless of how hard you work or how innovative you are, productivity plummets. There's a famous joke among Soviet workers: they pretend to pay us, and we pretend to work.
Wow. And they couldn't even feed themselves eventually.
That was the really humiliating part. Look at the 1972 drought. The USSR, this massive global superpower, had to buy grain from the United States to prevent mass starvation. A superpower that can't feed its own people is living on borrowed time.
Enter Mikhail Gorbachev.
Gorbachev takes over in the mid-1980s. He is younger, he sees the writing on the wall, and he tries to save the communist system with two famous reforms. You need to know these perestroika and glasnost.
Perestroika is the economic one, right?
Yes, it means restructuring. He tried introducing a little bit of free market mechanics, allowing some private enterprise, letting farmers sell a bit of surplus.
And glasnost.
Glasnost is openness, allowing people to actually criticize the government, report on the news accurately. He hoped that by exposing corruption, it would make the system more efficient. A great example is the Chernobyl nuclear disaster in 1986. Under glasnost, the horrific failures of the state were exposed to the public.
But these reforms backfired spectacularly.
Completely, because you can't half open a pressure cooker. Once people could speak freely, they didn't just criticize a corrupt factory manager, they criticized the entire system. They criticized the gulags, the secret police, the lack of human rights.
And then, in 1989, Gorbachev creates the ultimate opening. He announces the end of the Brezhnev Doctrine.
This is the fatal blow to the empire. The Brezhnev Doctrine was the rule for decades that said if a satellite state tries to leave communism, Soviet tanks will roll in and crush them, like they did in Hungary in '56 or Prague in '68.
And Gorbachev says, we aren't doing that anymore.
He announces that the Soviet military will no longer intervene in the domestic affairs of Eastern Europe. He refused to use force to maintain the empire.
And the moment that threat of tanks was gone,
the revolutions erupted instantly. It was like a dam bursting. Poland's Solidarity Movement, which is a trade union, wins sweeping democratic elections. Hungary literally opens its borders to the West.
And the big one, November 1989.
The Berlin Wall comes down. The ultimate symbol of the Cold War division is physically torn apart by everyday citizens with sledgehammers.
It's an incredible visual, and shortly after, you get German reunification. And by 1991, the USSR itself dissolves into 15 independent states.
And just like that, the bipolar world order is gone. The map of Europe is rewritten almost overnight. It's a breathtaking collapse.
It's incredible how fast it went in the end. But we need to rewind a bit, because while all this geopolitical drama was happening, while the nukes were being pointed and the wall was falling, Western Europe was pulling off an absolute miracle of its own. Let's move to part 2, Western Reconstruction and Economic Integration.
This is the story of how Western Europe went from a smoking pile of rubble to an economic powerhouse in record time.
The context here is 1945. The war is over, but Europe is destroyed. I mean, cities are leveled. Infrastructure is gone. People are literally starving in the streets of major capitals.
And there was a genuine palpable fear in Washington that this extreme poverty would drive populations straight toward communism.
Because hungry people listen to anyone who promises bread.
Exactly. If democracy meant starvation and unemployment, and communism meant a guaranteed job and food, people would choose food. Ideology doesn't fill a stomach.
So the U.S. opens the checkbook, the Marshall Plan.
1947 to 1951, it's officially called the European Recovery Program. The U.S. injects roughly $13 billion of capital into Western Europe.
That is hundreds of billions in today's money. But it wasn't just charity, was it?
No, it was deeply strategic. It was an investment,
Friends.
buying stability. The goal was to rebuild the infrastructure so these countries could stand on their own and, crucially, stand against domestic communist parties.
Yeah.
Because France and Italy had very strong communist parties at the time. Also, from a purely self-interested standpoint, the U.S. needed trading partners. American factories were booming, but you can't sell Ford cars to people who don't have a currency.
Right, you need a market to sell to. So what were the results of all this cash?
Astounding. Almost unbelievably fast. By 1950, industrial output in Western Europe had actually surpassed pre-war levels. The Marshall Plan kick-started a self-sustaining cycle of massive economic recovery.
We call it the economic miracle.
Yes, especially in West Germany, the Wirtschaftswunder. By 1955, West Germany alone was producing more economic output than the entire undivided German nation had produced before the war.
That is insane.
It was. And it completely validated the capitalist democratic model in the eyes of the public. It proved that freedom could put food on the table.
And this changed how everyday people lived. We see the rise of the consumer economy in Europe.
Right. It wasn't just about rebuilding heavy industry to make steel and tanks anymore. It was about consumer goods. Wages were rising steadily. The middle class was expanding rapidly. People were suddenly buying washing machines, cars, refrigerators, televisions.
So Europe was becoming a consumer society, very much like the United States in the 1950s.
Very similar. But there was a massive difference in how their societies were structured. The European model included a massive social safety net, the creation of the welfare state.
This is a key distinction for the AP exam. How did this work?
Western European democracies broadly adopted Keynesian economics, which is the idea of using government spending to stimulate economic growth and manage cycles. But they paired that with what we call cradle-to-grave care systems.
Meaning the government takes care of you from the moment you are born until the day you die. Great Britain is the main model here, right?
Yes, under the Labour Party, immediately post-war, they created the National Health Service, the NHS. They introduced subsidized health care for all, free education, robust unemployment insurance, and old age pensions.
And what was the philosophy behind that? Just being nice.
No, it was a profound shift in the social contract. The idea was that the state has a fundamental moral duty to protect its citizens from the harshness of the free market. You don't just leave people to starve if a factory closes.
And I imagine everyone loved it until they couldn't afford it.
Exactly. It was funded by high taxes, which people accepted during the boom years of the 50s and 60s because everyone was making money. But the 1970s changed everything. We hit a severe economic period called stagflation.
What is that exactly? It sounds like a nasty disease.
Economically, it basically is. It's an economist's absolute nightmare. Usually, inflation prices going up happens when the economy is booming and people are spending. Stagflation is the worst of both worlds. It's stagnant economic growth plus high inflation.
So the economy stopped growing, unemployment goes up, but prices keep rising anyway.
Exactly. Largely triggered by the OPEC oil crises in the 70s, which caused energy prices to skyrocket.
And welfare states are really expensive to run.
Extremely expensive. And this created a massive dilemma for European governments. Politicians didn't want to cut social benefits because voters would immediately vote them out of office. But tax revenue was falling because the economy was stagnant.
So what did they do?
They started deficit spending, borrowing massive amounts of money just to pay for the day-to-day programs.
Which eventually leads to a political backlash.
Yes, the neoliberal turn in the 1980s. You see leaders like Margaret Thatcher, the conservative prime minister in the UK, come into power.
What was her solution?
She argued that the welfare state had made Britain lazy and uncompetitive. She pushed for privatization of state-owned industries, shrinking the size of the government, crushing the power of labor unions, and cutting taxes. It was a direct, forceful response to the crisis of the welfare state. She famously argued that, quote, there is no such thing as society, only individual men and women and their families.
A complete pivot from the post-war consensus. Now, alongside this economic rebuilding and restructuring, there was a quiet, bureaucratic, but incredibly important political rebuilding happening, the move toward European integration. This is essentially the origin story of the EU.
And this is fascinating because it wasn't originally about trade, not at its core. It was about peace. The logic was simple but profound. If we bind our economies so tightly together, we literally cannot physically fight each other anymore.
And they started with the most warlike industries, coal and steel.
The European Coal and Steel Community, the ECSC, established in 1951, was driven by France, West Germany, Italy, and the Benelux countries.
Why coal and steel specifically?
Because you cannot build an army without them. You can't build tanks, artillery, or rifles without steel and coal. If those specific industries are managed supranationally, meaning by an authority above the individual nation state, then secret rearmament by Germany or anyone else is physically impossible.
That is brilliant. It's using economics and bureaucracy to enforce peace.
It is. It worked so well that from there, it just grew. It expanded into the common market in 1957 with the Treaty of Rome, which covered general trade goods, eliminating tariffs between member states.
And then it eventually becomes the European Union.
With the Maastricht Treaty in 1993, that shifted it from just an economic trading bloc into a political union.
The EU is a huge, complex topic, but what are the main features the listener needs to know for this unit?
There are three main pillars you should remember. One, the euro. This is the single currency launched around the turn of the millennium. It creates massive economic efficiency because you don't have to exchange francs for marks or liras when doing business. But it means individual nations lose control of their own monetary policy. They can't devalue their currency in a crisis.
That's a big sacrifice of sovereignty. What's the second?
The European Parliament. Transnational governance. They pass laws in Brussels that actually supersede national laws in certain areas like environmental regulations or human rights.
And the third?
Free movement, officially the Schengen area. This means the abolition of internal border checks. You can drive a truck full of goods or just travel on vacation from Portugal all the way to Poland without ever showing a passport.
But this integration hasn't been without pushback, right? It's not a straight, easy line to a United States of Europe.
Absolutely not. And Brexit is the ultimate case study for the exam. In 2016, the United Kingdom voted to leave the European Union entirely.
Why? If the economic benefits were so good.
Because it highlights the central tension of modern Europe integration versus national sovereignty. The British voters, or at least the slight majority of 52%, wanted control over their own borders, their own immigration policies, and their own laws, even if it meant taking a severe economic hit by leaving the single market.
They wanted to take back control, as the slogan went.
Exactly. And that tension between being a sovereign nation and being part of a supranational bloc is still very much alive today across the continent.
Okay, let's zoom out. While Europe was integrating internally, its relationship with the rest of the world was crumbling. Let's move to part 3, global realignments, nationalism, and migration.
This is the story of decolonization, the rapid dismantling of those massive global empires we talked about in 1914.
What drove this? Why did the empires fall apart so incredibly fast after World War II?
There were three main drivers. First, sheer exhaustion. Europe was broke. Empires are incredibly expensive to maintain. You need standing armies, administrators, infrastructure. Europe needed every penny to rebuild its own bombed-out cities. They couldn't afford to police the world anymore.
Makes sense. What's the second?
Ideology. You can't fight a massive bloody war against Hitler in the name of freedom, democracy, and self-determination, and then go home and continue to violently oppress colonies in Africa and Asia. The hypocrisy was just too glaring. The moral justification for empire collapsed.
And the third driver?
Cold War pressure. The U.S. and the USSR were both generally anti-colonial, for completely different reasons, obviously, but they were actively vying for influence in these regions. They supported independence movements to gain allies.
And the paths to independence varied wildly depending on where you look.
It depended entirely on the colonizer and the specific colony. Take India in 1947. This is the classic example of negotiated independence.
Gandhi.
Yes, Gandhi and the Indian National Congress used civil disobedience and nonviolent resistance to simply make the British realize that governing India against its will was economically and politically futile. The British agreed to leave, though the subsequent partition between India and Pakistan was incredibly tragic and resulted in millions of deaths.
Compare that negotiated exit to Algeria.
Algeria was a total bloodbath from 1954 to 1962. The difference was that France didn't consider Algeria a colony. They considered it legally part of France proper, a department of the nation.
Because there were so many French settlers living there.
Exactly. Over 1 million French citizens lived in Algeria. So France fought a brutal, torturous war to keep it. The Algerian War nearly tore the French government apart. Vietnam was a similar story of violence. The French violently refused to let go of Indochina until they were decisively militarily defeated at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu.
And once these nations finally became independent, they faced a new challenge in this bipolar world.
The non-aligned movement. These newly independent nations, led by leaders in places like India, Egypt, and Yugoslavia, didn't want to be pawns of the US or the Soviets. They tried to chart a third path.
But I imagine it was incredibly difficult to stay neutral when the superpowers were showing up, offering billions of dollars in aid and weapons.
Almost impossible. But they tried to leverage the superpower competition to their own advantage.
Now, speaking of new nations and changing borders, let's look back inside Europe. When the Cold War ended, we saw a sudden resurgence of violent nationalism inside Europe itself.
This goes back to the deep freeze theory, the idea that Soviet communism essentially froze historical ethnic tensions in place. It suppressed them with an iron fist and secret police. When the Soviet system collapsed, those historical tensions thawed out rapidly and violently.
And the ultimate tragedy here is Yugoslavia.
This is the darkest chapter of European history in the 1990s. Yugoslavia was a complex, multi-ethnic state held together for decades by a strongman communist dictator named Tito.
And when he died, and then communism fell.
The country fractured along ethnic and religious lines. Serbs, Croats, Bosniaks. It descended into a horrific civil war.
And we saw the return of a word to Europe that everyone hoped they would never hear again: genocide.
Yes. In the Bosnian War, starting around 1992, Serbian forces under the leadership of Slobodan Milosevic conducted what they called ethnic cleansing against Bosnian Muslims. The massacre at Srebrenica in 1995, where thousands of men and boys were executed, was a horrific reminder that modern Europe was not immune to the barbarism of the past. It shocked the conscience of the world and forced NATO to eventually intervene militarily.
And we saw separatist movements elsewhere, too, fighting for national identity.
Right. Chechnya in Russia, which sought independence and was brutally, violently suppressed by the Russian military over 2 wars, the Basques in Spain, the ETA, and the IRA in Northern Ireland.
They utilized terrorism to seek autonomy or separation.
Yes. It shows that nationalism wasn't just a 19th century problem. It remained a potent, violent force even in the age of European integration.
Now let's flip the movement of people. Instead of Europeans going out to govern colonies, we have people coming in. Let's talk about migration.
This is absolutely crucial for understanding modern European demographics and politics today. Remember that economic miracle we discussed?
The booming factories in the 50s and 60s.
Exactly. Well, booming factories need millions of workers. And Europe had lost millions of working-age men in the war. There was a massive labor shortage.
But they invited people in.
They created guest worker programs. West Germany recruited heavily from Turkey. France recruited from its former colonies in North Africa. The UK recruited from the Caribbean and South Asia. The idea in the minds of the governments was purely economic and temporary. Come work for a few years, help us rebuild, and then go home.
But the key word there is guest. It implies they would leave.
Right, and they didn't. As the Swiss writer Max Frisch famously said, "We asked for workers, but human beings came. People aren't just labor units. They settled down, they started families, they built communities and businesses, and this profoundly changed the cultural and demographic fabric of Europe." For example, we see the rise of Islam as a major permanent European religion.
And this demographic shift created friction.
Massive friction, especially when the economy turned down in the 1970s during stagflation. Suddenly, there aren't enough jobs for everyone. And these former guests were increasingly viewed by the native populations as competitors for scarce jobs and housing. The rhetoric shifted to, "They are taking our jobs."
And we see the political backlash to this.
The rise of right-wing, anti-immigrant political parties. The National Front in France, founded by Jean-Marie Le Pen, the Freedom Party in Austria. They campaigned on slogans essentially meaning Europe for Europeans, fueling a cultural tension that defines European politics to this very day.
It's the clash between the reality of a diverse multicultural society and the old 19th century idea of the ethno-state.
Exactly. And this ties directly into the broader forces of globalization.
Right, because migration is just one part of a shrinking world.
You also have the rise of multinational corporations, Nestle, Volkswagen, BP operating globally, international trade networks tying economies together so tightly that a bank failure in New York ruins an economy in Greece.
And cultural globalization, too, the Americanization of culture.
Yes, McDonald's opening in Paris, Hollywood movies dominating cinemas everywhere, American pop music on the radio. Many Europeans, especially the French, felt like they were losing their distinct cultural identity to this globalized, Americanized monoculture.
And what about the reaction to the environmental cost of all this hyper-industrial globalization?
That leads to the rise of green parties in European politics. The turning point here is really the Chernobyl nuclear disaster in 1986. That was a terrifying wake-up call that a radioactive cloud doesn't stop at a national border. Pollution is transnational.
So Europe became a pioneer in environmental politics.
Because they had to. They saw the direct, devastating consequences of industrial globalization on their own small, crowded continent.
Okay, we are in the home stretch now. We've done the politics, the economics, the wars, the borders. Now let's talk about the people living through all of this. Part 4, social, cultural, and technological transformations.
The biggest, most profound shift here is arguably the changing status of women.
We talk about two distinct waves of feminism in the 20th century.
First wave feminism was primarily early 20th century. The focus was on suffrage, the legal right to vote, and the major catalyst here was actually World War I.
How so?
Women's role in wartime production. With millions of men at the front, women stepped into munitions factories, driving ambulances, running farms. It made it politically impossible for governments to deny them the vote after the war. You can't tell someone they're enough of a citizen to build an artillery shell for the state, but not enough of a citizen to cast a ballot.
So they get the vote, and then the second wave comes later.
The 1960s and 70s. This wave was less about basic legal rights and more about deeply ingrained societal and domestic inequality. The intellectual foundation for this in Europe is Simone de Beauvoir's landmark book, The Second Sex.
What was her main argument?
She argued that throughout history, women were defined as the other in relation to men. Men were the default human, women were the deviation. Second-wave feminists focused on dismantling that. They fought workplace discrimination, pushed for equal pay, fought for reproductive rights, and brought issues like domestic violence out of the shadows.
And we start seeing women breaking the ultimate political glass ceilings.
Yes. Margaret Thatcher becoming Prime Minister of the UK in 1979, Edith Cresson becoming Prime Minister of France, Mary Robinson as President of Ireland. Women were finally leading major global powers. It was a massive, visible restructuring of the social hierarchy.
You mentioned reproductive rights. This links directly to incredible leaps in technology and medicine.
Specifically, the birth control pill, introduced in the 1960s. We really cannot overstate its historical impact.
Why is it so revolutionary historically?
Because it decoupled sex from procreation reliably for the first time in human history. It allowed women to plan their careers, plan their education, and plan their families in a way that was biologically impossible before. It fundamentally changed workforce demographics and the traditional family structure.
And then later, IVF.
In vitro fertilization. The first test tube baby was born in the UK in 1978. It challenged traditional religious views of infertility and gave individuals even more agency over reproduction. Science was literally taking control of biological destiny.
But I have to imagine this created immense tension with traditional religion.
Huge tension. The Catholic Church, specifically, found itself at a crossroads. During the 1960s, you have Vatican II, which modernized the church in many ways, making the liturgy more accessible, allowing Mass to be spoken in local languages instead of just Latin.
Trying to adapt to the modern world?
But when it came to social issues, the church held the line firmly against artificial contraception and abortion. This created a profound rift. You had an increasingly secularized European society pulling one way and traditional religious institutions pulling the other.
It's the expansion of individual autonomy clashing with traditional authority. And what of the arts and intellectual life? How did European culture respond to the trauma of 2 world wars and the threat of nuclear annihilation?
Well, after the trenches of World War I and the gas chambers and atomic bombs of World War II, the old 19th century Enlightenment idea that the world was rational and steadily progressing toward perfection, that seemed like a sick, cruel joke.
So what replaces it?
Existentialism. Philosophers like Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus in France. The core philosophy is that the universe is inherently absurd and meaningless. There is no grand design. Therefore, you are radically free, and you have to create your own meaning through your actions.
That famous phrase, God is dead.
Nietzsche said it in the 19th century, but the post-war generation truly felt it in their bones. And later you get postmodernism, which rejects the idea of objective truth altogether, arguing that truth is culturally conditioned.
And how does this manifest in art?
A total rejection of realism.
Yeah.
If reality is a nightmare of trenches and nuclear standoffs, why would you want to paint it realistically? You get cubism, like Picasso, breaking forms apart. Dadaism, like Duchamp's Fountain, which was literally a urinal, it was anti-art, mocking traditional aesthetic values. Surrealism, like Salvador Dali, painting melting clocks, focusing on the subconscious and dreamscapes. It was all about the irrational.
Even architecture changes.
Yes, the Bauhaus movement in Germany. Function over form, stripping away the ornate decorations of the imperial era for clean, efficient, functional design.
And finally, culturally, we have to talk about the counterculture. The youth revolts of 1968.
1968 is the year the world seemed to catch fire. You had massive student and worker protests, especially in Paris. They took to the streets, ripping up cobblestones to throw at police.
What were they so angry about? They grew up in the economic miracle.
That was exactly the point. The post-war generation, the baby boomers, grew up with material wealth, but they found the society suffocating. They were challenging the conservative bourgeois establishment, the Vietnam War, the rampant consumer culture. It showed that the post-war stability was actually quite fragile. They wanted meaning, authenticity, and social freedom, not just refrigerators and stable jobs.
So we have covered a full century of destruction, rebuilding, ideological division, and unprecedented integration. It is a massive, complex arc. Let's bring it all together for the listener. What is the final synthesis here for Unit 9?
If we look at Unit 9 as a whole, for the AP exam, it's a story of transition across 3 main axes. First, power. Europe goes from being the undisputed center of the global universe in 1914 to just one player in a multipolar system by the end of the century. It had to fundamentally humble itself.
Second axis.
Structure. We go from a continent completely torn apart by nationalist rivalries to the rigid bipolar freeze of the Cold War, and finally to the unprecedented supranational experiment of the European Union.
And the third axis, socially?
A dramatic, irreversible expansion of individual rights, feminism, the expansion of the welfare state, reproductive autonomy. The individual became more important than the dictates of the state or the church. But, and this is crucial, all of this happened amidst the persistent underlying tension of nationalism.
That really seems to be the recurring ghost in the European machine. They try to bury nationalism under economics and treaties, but it keeps climbing right out of the grave.
It absolutely does. If you remember one phrase, remember, this war shattered Europe between 1914 and 1945. Integration and the Cold War rebuilt and structured it, and globalization has transformed it.
And here is the provocative thought I want to leave everyone with as we wrap up this deep dive. Europe succeeded largely in creating peace on the continent through economic integration. The EU worked in that regard. France and Germany are not shooting at each other, but
But the persistent rise of nationalist and anti-immigrant sentiment, which we literally see playing out right now in modern elections across Europe, raises a massive unresolved question.
right, can a supranational identity, this idea of just being European, ever truly replace the primal historical pull of the nation state?
Or is the tension between being French or German and being European a permanent, unsolvable feature of the modern age?
A permanent tension. That is definitely something to chew on as you review your notes.
Indeed. It's not just a history question. It's the defining political question of the 21st century for Europe.
Well said. Thank you to everyone for listening to this deep dive into AP Euro Unit 9. Good luck on the exam, keep digging into those historical sources, and we will catch you next time.